Hello, everyone. I'm Tolde Stefanos, and this is ERISAT's The Power of One program. Today is January 23rd, 2025. Dr. Michael Rubin is my guest today. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. He wrote an article on January 6th advocating regime change in Eritrea, and I have invited him to elaborate on those ideas. Dr. Rubin, welcome, and thank you for being here. I know you don't have that much time, so we'll jump in and get started. You say the U.S. should openly support regime change in Eritrea. That's pretty bold and direct. What was missing for the U.S. not to have acted in favor of regime change before, and how likely is it now for the new Trump administration to act on your recommendations?
Well, I hate to say one of the reasons why the United States hasn't acted on this is simply because the United States traditionally, both under Republicans and Democrats, too often ignores Africa and African issues. The reason why it's becoming more important now, however, is twofold. Number one, we're coming to the end of Isaias's time in office anyway. I mean, he can avoid elections, but he can't avoid aging. And the fact of the matter is he's already had a stroke and he's coming to the end of his life. So number one, we've got to be prepared. Number two, the human rights situation in Eritrea is grave and growing. Now, some people within the Trump administration and in the United States would say that's Eritrea's problem. It doesn't impact the United States. But there are a number of follow-on effects from the human rights situation as we have it now. And the same networks that provide human trafficking also provide transit for terrorists. And it's the same criminal networks, the same criminal gangs. That's number one. Refugee flows we see can be very destabilizing throughout the region. That's number two. And the third reason is because with the Red Sea becoming increasingly important, the United States can no longer afford to ignore what's happening. Now, personally, I favor the human rights approach. What's happening in Eritrea is tragic, and it's long overdue that the United States act. The fact of the matter is, Eritrea could be the pearl of the region. It could be a fabulously wealthy country for all Eritreans, not just the ruling family. Especially given the education of Eritreans, given the human capital, given the location of Asmara. And there's absolutely no reason why Eritrea can't shine, and the United States should be its partner as it does.
Just to go on to the human rights aspect of it, you probably know that Siham Ali, a U.S. citizen, has been jailed by the regime for more than 12 years. She was jailed when she was 15, and two U.S. employees also disappeared about 20 years ago. What would it take to have President Trump issue there will be hell to pay warning unless Siham and all U.S. citizens are freed immediately? Could this be a trigger point for the regime change idea that you're advocating?
The answer is absolutely yes. We've seen under Trump version 1.0 that Trump, for example, promised to bring down the Turkish economy if they didn't release American pastor Andrew Brunson. And with just a few tariffs on steel, Trump managed to achieve his relief without paying any ransom. The problem, realistically, is that under Isaias, Eritrea has become so poor that there's just very little leverage economically and in terms of sanctions. That said, when we see how the Eritrean ruling family steals money and takes it abroad, that really is the point of leverage we have. If we can help the Eritrean people repossess the money which the Isaias and his family have stolen, that is something that, frankly, Isaias would never want to deal with. He sees himself as a king. He sees himself as an empire, an emperor. He sees himself as someone who should be fabulously wealthy, a billionaire. He doesn't care about his people. So the fact of the matter is, we need to go after Isaias and Isaias personally.
In fact, I want to focus on one paragraph in your article where you say the money Isaias and his cronies have stolen and sent abroad should be identified, seized, and placed in a fund that a provisional Eritrean government can utilize and apply to the country's reconstruction. I mean, great idea. As you know, and as you mentioned earlier, the regime runs various embezzlement schemes. It tripled or quadrupled the foreign revenue currency that it gets by just changing the local currency. No matter how much money you have in the bank, you can only withdraw $300 a month. There is no sign Eritrea's gold revenues have trickled down to benefit the local economy. In fact, Isaias boasts how thoroughly he has destroyed the country and its economy, a hand-to-mouth economy, as he puts it, with contempt. I can go on. So what tools and resources can Eritreans and friends of Eritrea use to find and recover the stolen money, as he put it?
Well, you know, this is really the job of the U.S. Treasury Department. Now, too often, when we think about U.S. foreign policy, people think about the U.S. State Department, the equivalent of a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They think about the Pentagon, the Defense Department. But in reality, some of the most effective actions we see occur with regard to the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Now, they have the ability to basically trace funds, to trace monies, and are the best able to identify where these monies are going overseas. And so what it will take is someone in the National Security Council, National Security Advisor, for example, Mike Waltz, or the incoming Undersecretary of State for Africa, Peter Pham, to basically say at a National Security Council meeting, this needs to be our priority. We need to, from above, tell the U.S. government that when it comes to Eritrea, they need to track every single dollar that's coming in and out of the country. And if it means putting liens on individuals and their houses and so forth, that's fine too. I would also go further and say one strategy that might be taken in the United States is what's called a RICO suit, a racketeering suit. This is what brought down the mafia. And the key with a RICO suit, RICO, if any of your audience wants to Google it, is that everyone involved in the scheme is presumed equally guilty. And therefore, they have a choice. They can either turn state's evidence and start giving evidence against those involved in the criminal scheme, or they will suffer the same consequences, losing their house, losing their money, losing their livelihood, being put in prison. And the question is, how many within the diaspora, for example, in the United States, really want to spend their life in prison because Isaias Afwerki wants to be a billionaire?
Right. So the U.S. embassies, the Eritrean embassies in the U.S. or in Europe and Canada, are involved in collecting a 2% tax, as they call it. How liable are they personally, and what can be done, to basically stop the embezzlement schemes they've been continuing to do for years and years?
First of all, let me say that the 2% tax is illegal according to United Nations Security Council resolutions. Let me also say that the United States taxes our own expatriates. I will say that that is extremely bad policy on the part of the United States, and we should not do it. But when Eritreans will say, people who are representing the government, that the that the Americans do it and there's no difference to what the Eritrean government is doing, that's simply false. There's no equivalence. What the Americans are doing are taxing our citizens. And if our citizens give up their citizenship, they no longer need to pay the tax. What the Eritreans are doing are taxing people based on their ethnicity or former nationality. And they're doing it, it's more of an extortion scheme. Once you pay the money, you are forced to join specific organizations where you have to pay further dues. So it's a continuing extortion scheme. The fact of the matter is that the United States shouldn't participate in the 2% and should target those legally who are doing so on American soil or European soil. We also need, and this goes to your previous question, to start sanctioning the Eritrean banks, which act as basically criminal recipients of these sorts of money. And I mentioned this in my article. That really is the next step. Targeting the Eritrean banks, both sanctioning them as entities of a terrorist or criminal enterprise, and then establishing criminal liability for anyone who sends money to them. And then you can allow the Eritrean diaspora to decide whether it really is worth it, given that they would be violating racketeering or anti-terrorist laws should they fund Eritrean banks.
One of the challenges could be the money could be hidden, I don't know, in places where it's not accessible, China, Russia. What can the U.S. Treasury do in terms of tracing, that kind of the deposits where they maybe in Chinese or Russian banks or something like that?
Look, I mean, honestly, it's quite difficult, but we've seen cases where this has occurred before. A number of countries have returned money that was stolen by Iraqis and sent to Dubai and Lebanon. And you know that both Dubai and Lebanon can be very, very difficult when it comes to issues of financial transparency. And yet the Iraqis, post-2003, succeeded in this. Cyprus and Armenia have both gotten off the money laundering lists by basically turning state's evidence and becoming far less opaque than they used to be. So too have the Cayman Islands. And when that doesn't work, we see issues such as we've seen with the Panama Papers, where specific leaks can become involved. Now, if countries like China and Russia won't play ball, what you do have is an ability with regard to reputational risk, where some of their companies who want to deal on the world stage are going to be very reticent to be tied to this sort of scheme. The question then becomes for the Russians or the Chinese, would you rather hide Azayas's money, or would you rather do business with the rest of the world, but you can't do both? That's how the U.S. Treasury Department works. That's how financial sanctions work. And that's why it may be difficult to identify and compel the return of some money, but it is possible to wage economic warfare, not against the Eritreans, but against the Azayas family, because make no mistake, the returned money comes not to the United States. It comes to funding Eritrea so that it can build itself into the Singapore it deserves to be, rather than the North Korea on the Red Sea.
Right, right. As you know, Eritrea has been destroying its human capital for decades, basically wasting millions of man-years of productivity. So if a system collapse happens before Eritreans are organized properly, all kinds of bad actors can rush in to fill the vacuum. For example, mercenary armies like the Wagner Group, super rich Gulf states, desperate neighbors, and even feuding local warlords. What is your advice for Eritreans inside and outside the country on how to build the necessary alliances with the U.S. and others to prevent such scenarios from happening and increase the chances for Eritreans to own their destiny?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Eritrea is not alone. In 2006, I traveled to Gdansk, Poland, for a conference marking the 25th anniversary of the Solidarity Movement. Lech Walesa, who had gone from a labor leader in opposition to being the president of Poland, was there. So too were Cubans, Zimbabweans, and all sorts of peoples from other countries, both those which have had successful democratic revolutions and those that had yet to do so at the time. And what they were all talking about was lessons learned. So, for example, when the change comes, we know this, and we've seen this with Syria. The change, when the change comes, it's going to come much faster
Mhm.
than anyone expects, whether it's Isaias and his family or whether it's the Eritrean people. And it's important now to actually form the networks so that you can fill the vacuums, so that you can think not only about the evils of Isaias Afwerki and why he deserves to hang from the gallows, but instead talk about how you are going to repair the education system, how you're going to repair commerce, how you're going to repair free trade, how you're going to prevent a situation like what happened in Russia in 1991, where you had rise of oligarchs distort the economy. These are the discussions which should be being had in all sorts of countries outside Eritrea now, because the Eritrean diaspora is incredibly strong, is incredibly able, and they can learn the lessons learned from other states that have failed in this transition, skip a few steps, and really enrich their next generation with equity and with justice.
Right. You mentioned Peter Pham earlier and a few others who can be partners for this change. What does the diaspora Eritrean community need to do to get their support and to accelerate, the chances of change in Eritrea by involving such people and maybe even, think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, for example?
Well, first of all, let me use this opportunity to say that at the American Enterprise Institute, we take no foreign money and we take no U.S. government money. I personally take no foreign money or U.S. government money. And the point I'm making is this: the Eritrean government will buy lobbyists.
Mhm.
But as the expression goes, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. You can't change the fundamental rot that the Isaias regime represents. And so what you will find, and what the Eritrean diaspora will find, is that those who are advocating against Isaias Afwerki and on behalf of the Eritrean people are doing so because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
They're not accepting money. Whereas those who are lobbying on behalf of Isaias or his troll armies are doing it because they're doing it for cash. They're selling out their nationhood for the sake of a flat screen TV. It's absolutely shameful. Now, the point of this is that in the opposition, if anyone tries to sell you a bill of goods, the answer should be no, thank you. We want your support because we're on the right track, and we want you to do it because we're right, not because you want money. So that's number one. Number two, look, if the Eritreans decide that they're going to have 5 different opposition leaders and they're going to spend all their time fighting with each other, then ultimately they're going to delegitimize their cause. Now, in 1999, I just had received my PhD from Yale University. I came to Washington and I began working. And in Washington in 1999, I met someone named Barham Saleh. Barham was the representative in Washington of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, one of the 2 Kurdish groups, a member of Socialist International, and so forth. Now, there were 2 main Kurdish groups: the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, led by Jalal Talabani, and the Kurdistan Democratic Party, led by Masoud Barzani. And they had just fought a civil war with each other. They hated each other. And Barham Saleh had a rule in Washington that no matter how much he disliked the other Kurdish parties, when it came to talking to American officials, congressmen, diplomats, he would never criticize fellow Kurds. Because the second you criticize fellow Kurds in front of fellow Eritreans, in this case, in front of a non-Eritrean audience, the reaction is going to be, we're not, you guys don't have your act together. We're not going to get involved. We're not going to choose sides. So what you really need, and this is the most important thing, is a united front. Now, back to Barham Saleh. Because of this, he gained the respect of the United States. He gained the respect of Americans, and ultimately he became Iraq's president because he understood that there's a place for domestic politics and there's a place for nationalism. And in the halls of Congress, that's not the place for Eritrean domestic politics. So when Eritreans lobby, let's have the different opposition leaders do this. Not seek to delegitimize each other, but they should compete to see who can gain the most followers by being positive and by making Eritrea's case and by giving a clear view of the future. The other thing the Eritreans need to do is, look, it's an easy thing to say, Eritrea needs regime change. I mean, and in my article I said that, but I also tried to go beyond. Yeah. Because when you go to the US Congress, you know that you have the congressmen, of course, but most of the staff members are in their 20s, and they're the ones you need to convince. The same thing is true with many diplomats who are in their 30s or 40s. What you need to do is not just tell them we need change, but tell them this is how you are going to make change. These are the names of the people who you have to have the Treasury Department investigate. These are the properties who we know are held by illicit corporations, which are really shell companies for 𝐒𝐄𝐂𝐍𝐃 and his kids. These are the banks that you need to sanction. And if you go in with that plan, you would be shocked at how fast the United States will come on board. You need to do the research for the American congressmen. And that's where the opposition figures can really come in. And here I'm talking to you about the US Congress because I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., but the same thing is true in Brussels. The same thing is true elsewhere in the world. The fact of the matter is, when we talk about African solutions for African problems, what we need is not a police state as an African solution. We need a situation like Botswana, a thriving democracy, or Namibia, a thriving economy. That's the sort of vision which we should have when it comes to Eritrea.
No, thank you for making that very clear and strong point. I appreciate that. So, Dr. Rubin, just to expand the scope a bit, Somaliland has been a refreshing example of relative stability in this very volatile Horn of Africa, which is ironic since it's not even a sovereign nation. A couple of things. What lessons can we learn from Somaliland? And do you see scenarios where Somaliland can pursue the Taiwan path by attracting powerful allies who can help guarantee its security?
Well, look, when you look at the history of Somaliland, all your audience remembers what happened in Somalia proper upon the collapse of Said Barre, the dictator. And I mean, that was the era of Black Hawk Down. That's when you had various groupings start fighting, especially in Jubaland, in Mogadishu, even in Puntland and so forth. What basically happened in Somaliland was this. The business community was a bit separate from the political community. And the business community, and in the case of Somaliland, we're basically just talking about charcoal and livestock at the time back in 1991. They basically locked the clan leaders and the political leaders in a room and said, we don't want to happen here what happened to the rest of Somalia. So you need to come out with a compact. And it took several days, but they eventually came to an agreement, and it's been, I mean, there's problems in Somaliland, of course, but compared to the Puntland or the rest of Somalia, it's an oasis of security, stability. It's attracted businesses, the second largest Coca-Cola bottling plant in Africa, major airlines, not just the local airlines like Dalu. And let's not also forget about the Habshir and some of the money transfer companies, which are worth, Telesom, which are worth billions of dollars, quite literally. So they've had a fantastic transition. They've also dealt with the fact that, look, because Somaliland didn't get foreign aid because much of it was either stolen by Mogadishu or it wasn't given in the first place because it's not, as you said, a recognized sovereign state. You haven't had the ability for dysfunctional corruption to take root. When you're basically funding yourself from customs revenues from the Wajala border post with Ethiopia, then what you basically have is not enough money to steal. And that too can be refreshing. So the important thing with Eritrea is to have the diaspora invest rather than simply say we need to flood this country with money. Too much money too quickly can do more harm than good. But again, this is where the investing community comes in. This is where the diaspora really comes in. Now, the last thing I would put, ultimately, it's going to be the decision of people in the Horn of Africa and in Somalia and Somaliland to determine what the ultimate fate of Somaliland is. But what I always tell the Somalis in Mogadishu is this: if you want Somaliland to be a part of Somalia, you can't force it to be. You've got to make it want to be. You've got to actually perform better in Mogadishu than you do in Hargeisa, the capital of Somaliland. And so far, Mogadishu hasn't. And look, the diaspora, the Eritrean diaspora understands this. In the United States, we have mortgages. You can buy a house. You can buy a business with a bank loan and so forth. But in Somaliland, in the Horn of Africa, you rely on your family. You have to put that money down first to buy your house, to buy a business. Why would a Somalilander willingly, after putting that money down, hundreds of thousands of dollars to build a house or a business, why would they risk it all to go back to Mogadishu, which doesn't really have a system of transparency or a rule of law? This is why it's so important to have an established system of transparency and rule of law. I can't say enough what the human capital of Eritrea is, both those who are imprisoned in Eritrea itself, but also thank God for the Eritrean democracy in the United States. You contribute much more to the United States than we actually get from you. Yeah. The fact of the matter is that the discussions of how to do banking, of how to do investment, of regulation, that's what should be happening now in the Eritrean community. And that's why I thank you and your listeners for all your hard work in this. Ultimately, I'm an American. It's not my say what happens in Eritrea. But I want to empower the Eritreans because I think it would be good for them. And I think it would be good for the United States to have a democracy in the region, a thriving democracy, rather than a one giant prison camp, which is what Isaias has transferred the country into now.
Absolutely, yeah. And finally, Dr. Rubin, the Gulf states, especially UAE, is playing a destructive role in Sudan. Could Ethiopia be next, given Ethiopia's size and significance in the region? As bad as it is now, things can get worse. What trend lines does your research show regarding where the Horn of Africa is heading to? Any indicators things will get better?
There's an old Soviet joke, actually, about the difference between a Russian optimist and a Russian pessimist. Yeah. The Russian pessimist is the one who said, things have never been so bad. There's war, the economy, health, the environment. They couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one who said, no, they can always get worse. Unfortunately, we have that sort of dynamic right now in the Horn of Africa. Certain countries, I believe, like Somaliland, whether it's recognized or not, have really decided to take their own fates in their own hands. Yeah. Eritrea will in the future, and it's the right size and it has the right location to thrive if it has the right leadership. Once they throw out the thieves who currently treat the country like their own personal fiefdom. When it comes to Ethiopia, look, I understand the complaints that Abiy Ahmed has had with regard to the ethnic basis of federalism. But the way to change that is through a constitutional process, not through military force. By doing the short-term calculation of playing different ethnic groups off each other inside Ethiopia, what Abiy Ahmed is doing is setting the stage for decades of chaos, which will ruin the potential of Ethiopia. And like you said with Sudan, look, it's not only the United Arab Emirates which are playing a very negative role in Sudan. The fact is, the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis have decided to play out their own traditional proxy war inside Sudan at the expense of the Sudanese. Yeah. And when you have divisions like you have in Ethiopia, then ultimately the same dynamic can come into play in the future. I would hope we don't have these dynamics in the future in Eritrea. And what I would say is that if you are a true Eritrean nationalist, you would never allow the Russians or the Chinese, or for that matter, the Americans or the Emiratis or the Saudis to dictate to you or to pay you to do their bidding. You should build Eritrea because Eritrea can be a great nation and because it has such great potential. But the second you sell yourselves out as a proxy to someone else, you're betraying the dream for which generations of Eritreans have fought, leading up to Eritrea's independence in 1993, but for decades before that as well, against the Derg. And therefore, look, I mean, I wish I could be more optimistic about the Horn of Africa, but the buck stops with the peoples of Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and so forth.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Rubin. I appreciate your time and insights today. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.